The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor wax, clean but tired. Sunlight pushed through tall, narrow windows, cutting dusty stripes across rows of wooden benches. People sat quietly, most of them dressed in their best clothes, faces tight with nerves or boredom. It was just another Tuesday in County Courtroom 3, the kind of place where life-changing decisions happened without fanfare. At the front, behind a heavy oak bench, sat the judge. He was in his late 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and a reputation for running a tight ship. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years. Lawyers respected him. Defendants feared him. He spoke rarely, but when he did, everyone listened. Today's docket was routine. A few traffic violations, a small claims dispute, and one sentencing hearing for a young man who'd pled guilty to burglary. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would make the local paper. The bailiff stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a security camera. Court clerks typed softly. A public defender flipped through a file, sighing under her breath. Everything moved at the slow, predictable rhythm of the system, until it didn't. From the back row, a figure stood up. He was young, too young to be here alone, maybe 16. He wore jeans that had seen better days, a gray hoodie with a small tear near the pocket, and sneakers so worn the soles were nearly transparent. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, but his shoulders were straight and his eyes were fixed on the judge. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a stone dropped in still water. The judge looked up, eyebrows raised slightly. The bailiff took a step forward. "Son, you need to sit down," he said, low but firm. The boy didn't move. He took a breath, then spoke again, clear, calm, and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You knew him." 3 words. That was all, but the effect was instant. The judge went still. Not just quiet, still. Like someone had hit pause on a video. His pen hovered over the sentencing order. His face, usually unreadable, drained of color. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. For a long moment no one moved. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. The courtroom clerk stopped typing. The defense attorney turned in his chair. A woman in the front row clutched her purse tighter. The boy just stood there, eyes locked on the judge, waiting. Then the judge cleared his throat. "This court is in session," he said, but his voice lacked its usual steel. It sounded thin. "Who are you?" "I'm his brother," the boy said. A murmur rippled through the room. "Whose brother?" No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking it. The judge's fingers tightened around his pen. He glanced at the case file in front of him, the burglary sentencing. Nothing in it mentioned a brother. "Nothing connected. Your name?" the judge asked, slower now. The boy gave it. Just his first name, no last name. No address, no lawyer. He didn't need to say more. Some people in the room recognized it. Others didn't, but they could feel the shift in the air like before a storm. The bailiff moved closer. "Sir, this isn't the proper—" "Let him speak," the judge interrupted, cutting him off. Silence fell again, heavy, expectant. The boy didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "You saw him. In your courtroom. 5 years ago. He told you what he saw. You told him to go home and stay quiet." The judge's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward the gallery, then back to the boy. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. But the way his hand trembled slightly as he set the pen down told its own story. 5 years ago. A different docket. A different season. A scared teenager, older than this one, but not by much, had stood in this very spot accused of stealing a bike. The charges were minor, dropped after community service. But before he left, that older boy had asked to speak privately with the judge. He said he'd seen something he shouldn't have, something involving a city official late at night near the old warehouse district. He'd begged the judge to look into it. The judge had listened, nodded, told him to focus on staying out of trouble. Then he'd closed the file and moved on. He never followed up, never asked questions, told himself it was probably just a kid's overactive imagination, or worse, trouble he didn't need. Now here was the younger brother standing in the same spot with the same desperate look in his eyes. Only this time the older brother was gone, vanished, no body, no leads. Just silence. "You knew him," the boy repeated, softer this time, "and you knew what he was trying to do." The judge exhaled slowly. He looked down at the sentencing order in front of him, a young man's future resting on his signature. But right now that felt small, insignificant. Because something much bigger had just walked into his courtroom wearing a torn hoodie and carrying 5 years of unanswered questions. He turned to the bailiff. "Clear the docket for today," he said. "All remaining matters are continued." A few gasps. Confused whispers. The lawyers exchanged glances. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't how things worked, but the judge wasn't thinking about procedure anymore. He looked back at the boy. "Wait outside my chambers," he said. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." The boy nodded once. Not grateful. Not angry. Just resolved. He turned and walked out, his sneakers quiet on the polished floor. As the courtroom emptied, some people reluctantly, others quickly, eager to share what they'd just witnessed, the judge sat alone at the bench. He stared at the empty space where the boy had stood. His hands rested on the wood, steady now, but his mind was racing. He thought about the file he'd buried, the call he never returned, the report he'd marked unfounded without really looking, and the face of that older boy, earnest, scared, trying to do the right thing in a world that rarely rewarded it. Outside, the hallway was quiet. The boy leaned against the wall, arms crossed, staring at the floor. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times, what he'd say, how he'd stand, whether the judge would even listen. He'd skipped school for weeks to research court procedures. He'd saved bus fare. He'd written letters no one answered. This was his last chance, and deep down, he knew, if the judge walked away again, there might not be another. But for the first time in years, someone in a position of power had actually looked at him, really looked. Not as a nuisance, not as a statistic, but as a person with a story that mattered. Inside the courtroom, the judge stood up, straightened his robe, and walked toward his chambers. His steps were slower than usual, heavier, because sometimes 3 words are enough to shake a life built on silence. The boy didn't go home that night. He walked instead, past the bus stop, past the corner store with flickering neon, past the park where he and his brother used to play basketball until the streetlights came on. He ended up on a bench near the river, the kind of place adults warned kids to avoid after dark, but he wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. He'd been living in it for years. Back home, his grandmother would be waiting. She never asked too many questions. She'd just set an extra plate at dinner, leave the porch light on, and pretend not to notice the hollow look in his eyes. She'd lost a son. He'd lost a big brother, the one who taught him how to tie his shoes, who stayed up with him during thunderstorms, who told him, "Don't ever let fear decide what's right." That brother had disappeared on a Tuesday, just like the day of the courtroom. One minute he was walking home from his part-time job at the auto shop. The next, gone. No calls, no texts. No trail. Police took a report, asked a few neighbors, then filed it under runaway. But the boy knew better. His brother wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Not to him. Not to Grandma. 5 years, 5 birthdays with no presents, 5 Christmases with 1 less chair at the table, 5 years of watching his grandmother cry quietly in the kitchen while pretending to stir soup. He'd tried everything. Visited the police station so many times they knew him by sight. Talked to old friends who'd grown nervous and changed the subject. Scoured social media, message boards, even cold case forums. Nothing. Until he found an old court transcript buried in a public records archive. His brother's name, listed as a juvenile defendant. And the presiding judge, the same man who'd sat stone-faced in courtroom 3 just hours ago. That's when it clicked. His brother hadn't just vanished. He'd been silenced. Meanwhile, across town, the judge sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, his wife away visiting family, his grown kids long moved out. On his desk lay a manila folder, edges worn soft from years of being opened and closed. Inside were notes he hadn't looked at in half a decade. A faded photo of a teenage boy smiling beside a bike he'd fixed up himself. A handwritten statement never filed. A phone number that had long since been disconnected. He remembered the day clearly. Rain tapping the windows. The boy, older brother, standing nervously in his chambers, voice shaking but eyes steady. "I saw him," he'd said. "At the warehouse off 7th, it was late. He wasn't supposed to be there. And he wasn't alone. The judge had asked who he was. The boy had named a city councilman, someone well-connected, respected, often photographed shaking hands at charity events. The judge had frowned, told the boy it was serious to accuse a public official without proof. The boy had pulled a crumpled receipt from his pocket, dated, time-stamped, showing he'd been buying soda at a gas station across the street that night. Said he'd seen everything from the alley, but there was no video, no other witness. Just a kid with a story that sounded too big for his shoulders, so the judge did what the system taught him. He filed it away. Advised the boy to stay quiet for his own safety. Closed the juvenile case. Moved on. Now sitting in the dim light, the judge felt the weight of that choice like a stone in his chest. He hadn't been evil. He hadn't taken a bribe. He'd just chosen ease over risk, order over truth. And someone had paid the price. The next morning, the boy returned to the courthouse. Not to interrupt, just to wait. He sat on the same bench outside, backpack at his feet, eyes on the front doors. Reporters had started showing up, drawn by whispers of a judge shaken in open court. Cameras clicked. Questions flew. He ignored them all. Inside, the judge arrived early. He didn't go to his usual office. Instead, he walked straight to the records room, surprising the clerk with a request. Pull every file connected to that old juvenile case. Not just the official docket, internal memos, call logs, even discarded drafts. The clerk hesitated. That's unusual, Your Honor. I know, the judge said. Do it anyway. As boxes were wheeled in, he began sorting through paper like a man digging for buried treasure, or bones. And then he found it. A note in his own handwriting tucked in the back of a calendar from 5 years ago. Call PD re-witness protection inquiry. Follow up. But there was no follow-up. Just a blank space. A silence where action should have been. That afternoon, the judge sent a quiet message through a retired detective he trusted. I need to talk. It's about the warehouse case. The detective showed up that evening, skeptical but curious. Over coffee in a diner far from City Hall, the judge told him everything. The boy's testimony, his own inaction, the brother's disappearance. The detective listened, stirring his coffee slowly. We looked into that councilman once, he said finally. Got shut down fast. Higher-ups said it was a waste of time. But what if it wasn't? The judge asked. The detective sighed. Then we've got a lot of ghosts to answer to. Back at home, the boy opened his brother's old notebook, the one he'd kept hidden under his mattress. Page after page of sketches, observations, even license plate numbers. His brother had been documenting things for months before he vanished. Not out of malice. Out of hope. He believed someone in power would listen. Now the boy wondered, was the judge finally that someone? The next day, something unexpected happened. The judge didn't call the boy in. Instead, he walked out of the courthouse during lunch break, spotted him on the bench, and sat down beside him. No robes, no title, just two people in the sun. I read everything, the judge said quietly. All of it. The boy didn't look at him. And I was wrong, the judge said. Not because I doubted you, but because I didn't try hard enough to believe. The boy finally turned. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. Belief doesn't bring him back. No, the judge admitted. But truth might stop it from happening to someone else. They sat in silence for a while. Cars passed. A pigeon pecked at a crumpled wrapper. Then the boy asked, "What are you going to do?" The judge looked toward the courthouse, the place he'd spent his life upholding. "I'm going to reopen what I should have never closed." It wasn't a promise shouted from a podium. It was a quiet vow, spoken between two people who'd both lost something. And for the first time in 5 years, the boy felt something flicker inside him. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. That night, the judge called his wife. Not to explain everything, but to say, I might lose my job over this. She didn't ask why. She just said, then it's about time you did something worth losing it for. Meanwhile, the boy went home. He hugged his grandmother longer than usual. She didn't ask where he'd been. She just held on tight like she knew the storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, the wind was starting to change direction. In the days that followed, small things began shifting. A detective quietly re-interviewed old witnesses. A reporter dug into city contracts linked to the warehouse. And the judge, though still presiding over cases, started asking questions no one expected, about record retention, about oversight, about who really decides which cases matter. He wasn't leading a revolution. He was just doing his job, finally, fully, and the boy, he kept showing up. Not to demand, not to accuse, but to remind. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't speaking up. It's refusing to be forgotten. The days after the courthouse encounter settled into a strange rhythm, quiet on the surface but humming with tension underneath. The boy still showed up every morning, not inside the courtroom but on the stone steps outside, sitting with his backpack and a notebook. He didn't speak to reporters anymore. He just watched, waited, listened. Inside, the judge moved differently, slower maybe, but with more purpose. He stopped rushing through cases, started asking clerks questions like, was this file ever reviewed for inconsistencies? Or who signed off on this dismissal? People noticed. Not loudly. No one wanted to be the first to say it. But whispers followed him down the hallways. He's changed, one bailiff muttered to another, like he's seeing the job for the first time. Late one night, long after the courthouse emptied, the judge sat alone in his chambers with boxes stacked around him like walls. He'd pulled every archived file connected to that old juvenile case, even ones marked confidential or administrative only. Dust coated his fingers as he flipped through yellowed pages. Most were routine, intake forms, school records, probation notes. But then he found it, a sealed internal memo stamped with a city seal he recognized too well. It was brief. Just 2 paragraphs, but it carried weight. Per directive from Office of City Council Liaison, case number J4482, minor witness statement or raw warehouse activity, is to be treated as unsubstantiated. No further investigation recommended. File to be closed with prejudice. The date? 2 days after his brother had spoken to him in private. The judge stared at the paper like it might burn his hands. He'd never seen this memo before. It hadn't been in the official docket. Someone had slipped it into the system quietly, behind the scenes, and used his authority, his signature, to shut the whole thing down without his full knowledge. Or maybe they'd assumed he wouldn't push back, and he hadn't. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the empty square. For the first time, he didn't just feel regret, he felt complicit. The next morning, he called the retired detective again. This time, he handed him the memo without a word. The detective read it twice, then looked up, jaw tight. They buried it on purpose, he said. Not because there was nothing there, but because there was too much. That same day, the boy got a surprise visitor at the bus stop near his house. It was an older woman with kind eyes and a worn leather satchel. She introduced herself as a legal advocate who worked with youth affected by unresolved cases. She'd heard about what happened in court. "I'm not here to take over," she said gently. "But if you're willing, I'd like to help you organize what your brother left behind, so it can't be ignored again." The boy hesitated. He'd been burned by adults offering help before. But there was something in her voice, no pity, just respect. He nodded. Over the next week, they met in the back room of a community center. The boy brought his brother's notebooks, old text logs printed from a saved backup, even a shoebox of Polaroids his brother had taken around the warehouse district. The advocate didn't rush him. She let him tell the story in pieces in his own time. And as they sorted through it all, a pattern emerged. Not just random observations, but dates, times, vehicle descriptions, even partial license plates. His brother hadn't just seen something. He'd been building a case. Meanwhile, the judge made a decision that would change everything. He requested a private meeting with the chief judge of the district. No assistants, no recorders, just 2 men who'd worked together for decades. "I need to correct a mistake," he said simply. The chief judge listened, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When the story was done, he didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just sighed and said, "You know what this could cost you, right?" "I do," the judge replied. "But I've already cost someone else too much." A week later, a formal notice went out. The juvenile case involving the missing teenager was being reopened, not as a cold case file, but as part of an official judicial review into possible misconduct and evidence suppression. It wasn't front-page news, but in legal circles it sent ripples. Reporters started digging. City officials grew nervous. And the councilman, the one named in the original statement, issued a bland statement calling the allegations baseless and politically motivated. But the boy didn't care about press releases. He cared about truth. One evening, the advocate handed him a list. "These are people your brother mentioned," she said. "Some moved away. Some are scared. But 3 said they'd talk if it's safe. The boy's hands trembled as he read the names. One was a former night shift worker at the warehouse. Another was a gas station clerk who remembered the brother buying soda that night. The third was a former city employee who'd quit suddenly a month after the disappearance. He looked up. "Can we find them?" "We can try," she said. That weekend, they visited the gas station first. The clerk, now older and heavier, recognized the boy instantly. "You look just like him," he said softly. He confirmed the timestamp, said he remembered the brother pacing outside, looking shaken. He kept checking his phone, the clerk recalled. Then he left real fast when a black SUV drove by. The next stop was harder, a small apartment on the edge of town. The former warehouse worker opened the door halfway, chain still on. But when he saw the boy's face, he unhooked it without a word. Inside, over weak coffee, he admitted he'd seen things too. "We weren't supposed to be there after hours," he said. "But sometimes, deliveries came late, and not the kind you put on a receipt." He wouldn't say more, but he gave them a name, a contractor who'd handled special projects for the city, and a date. The same night the brother vanished. Back at the courthouse, the judge received a call from an unexpected source, the state attorney general's office. They'd heard about the reopened review, wanted to know if he'd be willing to cooperate with a broader investigation into possible corruption involving city contracts and missing persons cases. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Whatever it takes." That night he sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad. Not writing orders or rulings, but a personal statement. He wrote about his failure to act, about the trust he'd broken, about the boy who'd walked into his courtroom not with anger, but with a quiet demand for dignity. He didn't write it for the press. He wrote it for himself, and for the brother who never got to tell his full story. Across town, the boy lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. People were listening. Not because he shouted, but because he stood still long enough for them to hear. The system hadn't fixed itself, but cracks were forming, and through those cracks, light was starting to get in. He closed his eyes, not with hope yet, but with something close to it, because silence was finally being broken. And that in itself was a kind of justice. The courthouse steps had become a kind of quiet landmark, not for tourists or protesters, but for people who'd been told their stories didn't matter. A few started showing up in the mornings, not to speak, just to sit near the boy. An older man whose son vanished years ago, a woman whose complaint about unsafe housing was dismissed without inspection. They didn't say much, but their presence said everything. "We see you. We're still here." Inside, the judge no longer wore his robe like armor. He wore it like a responsibility, one he'd taken for granted for too long. He'd stepped down from active cases, citing personal review, but everyone knew why. He was working with state investigators now, not as a judge but as a witness, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't interpreting the law. He was trying to live up to it. The breakthrough came quietly, the way truth often does. A retired city clerk, reading about the reopened case in the local paper, called the Attorney General's office. She'd kept a personal log, just a small notebook of unusual file requests during her last year on the job. One entry stood out. A sealed envelope hand-delivered to the courthouse by a city aide, marked for judicial review, eyes only. She remembered because it wasn't standard procedure, and because the judge's office had signed for it, but no record of it ever appearing in the official case file. That envelope, it turned out, contained a sworn statement from a security guard who'd worked near the warehouse that night. He'd seen the missing teenager arguing with someone in a city vehicle. He'd tried to report it, but his supervisor told him to forget it ever happened. He'd written it down anyway, just in case. When the investigators tracked him down, he was hesitant at first. But then he met the boy. They sat in a small interview room, just the two of them, with a state attorney quietly observing. The guard, now in his 60s with tired eyes and thick glasses, looked at the boy for a long time. "You got his smile," he finally said. Then he told everything. The night the brother disappeared, he'd been doing rounds when he saw a black SUV pull up near the back gate. The teenager was already there, pacing, phone in hand. A man got out of the SUV, someone the guard recognized from city events. They talked. It got heated. Then the teenager shook his head and turned to leave. That's when another man came from the shadows. There was a struggle, quick, quiet. And then both men got back in the SUV and drove off. The teenager was gone. The guard had called his supervisor, was told to mind his own business, so he wrote it down, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it through the only channel he thought might listen, the court. But it never reached the right hands. Until now. The boy didn't cry. He just sat very still, absorbing every word like it was oxygen. Afterward, he thanked the guard, not with words, but with a nod that carried more weight than any speech. That same week, the judge submitted his full sworn statement to the State Ethics Board. He didn't hide behind legal jargon. He wrote plainly, "I failed to follow up on credible information. I allowed pressure, spoken and unspoken, to influence my judgment. In doing so, I failed a young man who trusted the system to protect him." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for accountability. News of the statement spread faster than anyone expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. A person in power admitting fault without excuses. Community groups held quiet vigils. Local schools started discussions about civic responsibility. Even the city council, under growing public pressure, announced a special oversight committee. The councilman at the center of it all held a press conference. He denied everything, called the claims a smear campaign fueled by grief and speculation, but his voice wavered, and he refused to answer direct questions about his whereabouts that night. People noticed. Meanwhile, the boy and the legal advocate kept working. They compiled every piece of evidence, the notebooks, the witness statements, the gas station receipt, the guard's testimony, and delivered it to the state police cold case unit. Not as a demand, but as a request. Please look again. This time they did. Within days, search teams returned to the warehouse district. Not with sirens or cameras, but with quiet determination. They combed through old storage units, reviewed decades of lease records, and interviewed former employees who'd stayed silent out of fear. One of them, a maintenance worker, finally admitted he'd been ordered to clean out a specific locker the morning after the disappearance. They said it was routine, he told investigators, but the locker had a bike lock on it, brand new. And inside, there was a jacket. Smelled like smoke. The jacket matched the one in a photo the boy had kept, one of his brother grinning after fixing up his bike. It wasn't proof of what happened, but it was proof he'd been there, and that someone had tried to erase it. Back at the courthouse, the judge met with the boy one last time. Not in chambers, but on those same stone steps where it all began. The sun was low, painting the building in gold and shadow. "I'm stepping down," the judge said. "Not because I have to, but because I should have long ago." The boy looked at him. "You're doing the right thing now." "Too late for him," the judge said quietly. "Maybe," the boy replied, "but not too late for others." They sat in silence for a while, watching people come and go, lawyers, clerks, families, strangers. The system kept turning, but something in it had shifted. A few days later, state authorities announced formal charges: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy related to the disappearance. The councilman was placed on administrative leave. The contractor named by the warehouse worker was brought in for questioning, and the cold case file was officially reclassified, not as a runaway but as a suspected homicide under active investigation. There were no cheers, no victory parades, just a quiet sense that a wrong was finally being named. The boy went back to school. He still carried his brother's notebook, but now it felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because it wasn't his alone to carry anymore. And the judge? He started volunteering at a legal aid clinic for teens, teaching them how to navigate the system without losing themselves in it. He didn't give speeches. He just listened, really listened, the way he should have years ago. Because sometimes justice isn't a gavel slamming down. It's a door opening, a file being reopened, a truth finally spoken aloud. And once it's out, it can't be put back. Time doesn't heal everything, but it does give people room to breathe again. A year after the boy stood up in that courtroom and said 3 words, life hadn't returned to normal. It had settled into something new, something quieter but more honest. The boy finished high school that spring. He didn't give a valedictorian speech or make headlines, but on graduation day, his grandmother sat in the 3rd row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd ironed that morning. She didn't say much afterward, just squeezed his hand and whispered, "Your brother would have been proud." That was enough. He didn't go straight to college. Instead, he took a part-time job at a community center that offered legal workshops for young people. He helped kids fill out forms, understand their rights, and, most importantly, believe their voices mattered. He never talked about what happened in court unless someone asked, and even then, he kept it simple. I just wanted someone to listen. The case itself moved slowly, as these things do. The councilman was indicted. The contractor cut a deal, revealing names, dates, even hidden bank transfers tied to city contracts. Investigators found more than anyone expected. Evidence of a small but tightly knit group that used public office to cover private dealings. It wasn't a conspiracy out of a movie. It was something far more ordinary and far more dangerous. People choosing convenience over conscience again and again until someone disappeared. The brothers' case remained open. No body was ever found, but the police now treated it as a homicide, and a dedicated unit reviewed it monthly. For the boy, that shift meant everything. Not because it brought closure, some wounds don't close, but because it meant his brother was finally seen as a person, not a file that got lost in the system. The judge, meanwhile, had traded his robe for a worn cardigan and a seat at a folding table in the back of a neighborhood library. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he ran a legal help desk for teens and families who couldn't afford lawyers. He didn't call himself a mentor. He called himself someone who's made mistakes and wants to help others avoid them. People were surprised to see him there, hunched over forms, explaining tenant rights or school disciplinary procedures in plain language. But he seemed more at peace than he ever had on the bench. He'd lost his title, his pension took a hit, and some old colleagues stopped returning his calls. But in the eyes of the kids who came to him scared and confused, he found something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: purpose. One afternoon, a teenager sat across from him, trembling as she described being threatened by a landlord. The judge listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't offer grand promises. He just said, "Let's write a letter together, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to the next step." The girl nodded, shoulders relaxing just a little. In that moment, the judge felt the weight of all those years he'd spent behind a bench, distant, authoritative, untouchable, and knew he'd never go back. Back in the courthouse, changes were happening too. New policies required all juvenile witness statements to be reviewed by an independent ethics officer. Court clerks received training on recognizing signs of coercion or cover-ups, and a memorial plaque, small, unassuming, was placed near the public entrance, listing the names of unresolved missing persons cases from the county, including the boy's brother. Not as a monument, but as a reminder, "We see you. We haven't forgotten." The boy visited the plaque once early in the morning before anyone arrived. He didn't leave flowers or notes. He just stood there for a minute, hand resting lightly on the cool metal, then walked away. He didn't need to perform grief. He carried it with him quietly, like a compass. On the anniversary of that courtroom moment, he returned to the courthouse, not to speak, but to watch. He sat in the back of courtroom 3, now presided over by a new judge, a woman known for her patience and sharp eye for detail. The docket that day was ordinary: a custody hearing, a small claims dispute, a traffic appeal. But the air felt different, lighter, more human. The new judge didn't rush. She asked questions. She made sure everyone understood what was happening. When a nervous teenager fumbled with paperwork, she paused the proceedings and said, "Take your time. This matters." The boy smiled just a little and left before the session ended. Later that evening, he met the retired detective and the legal advocate at a diner they'd come to think of as their unofficial headquarters. They ordered coffee and pie, no agenda, just conversation. The detective had since joined a nonprofit that reviewed cold cases involving young people. The advocate was pushing for state legislation to protect juvenile witnesses. And the boy? He was thinking about law school. Not to become a judge, but to work in public defense. "I want to be the person I needed back then," he said simply. No one argued. They just nodded, like it made perfect sense. As the months passed, the story faded from the news. No more headlines, no more camera crews. But in the community, it lived on, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. Teachers used it in civics class. Youth groups discussed it in meetings. And every so often, Someone would walk into the courthouse, look at the plaque, and whisper a name. The system hadn't been fixed overnight. It never is. But cracks had been pried open, and through them, light and people had started to move differently. One spring afternoon, the boy stood on the courthouse steps again, not as a protester or a petitioner, but as a visitor. A young girl, maybe 12, sat nearby with her mother, clutching a folder full of papers. She looked scared. The boy recognized that look. He walked over. "First time?" he asked gently. The girl nodded. "It's okay to be nervous," he said, "but don't let them make you feel small. You belong here just as much as anyone." The girl looked up at him, eyes wide. Then she sat a little taller. He walked away, hands in his pockets, the same way he had that first day. But this time his steps were lighter, because he'd learned something important. Justice isn't just about punishment or verdicts. It's about dignity, about being seen, about someone somewhere choosing to listen when it would have been easier to look away. And sometimes all it takes is 3 words, and the courage to say them, to start something that can't be undone.